morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the new kid on the block, so I'm Anne Marie Schubert, and this is my first experience having the opportunity to do this, so I consider this really exciting. So welcome. Welcome to the 16th Annual Outstanding Citizens Award. For those in this audience that are elected officials, I'm not going to individually recognize you because I'm sure there's many, and I want to try to recognize the citizens that we're here for today. When I started to think about this day, for those of us that are in this world of the criminal justice system and public safety, I'd like to think that this is why we do this job. This is why we're here. And I thought a lot about how do we define kind of why are we here, and how do we kind of represent who we're here to recognize. And I came across something, because many of you know that I like to do quotes. If I can't be a lawyer anymore, I might as well have my quotes, but this is kind of what I came up with, and this is how I would look at today, that there is a superhero inside all of us, but it takes courage to put on a cape. And so for those of you in this room that are being honored today, and for victims across this community and witnesses, thank you for putting on the cape. And I say that as well for our members of law enforcement that are not just here today, but those that are working in our community, because every day you put on that cape. So thank you for that. I want to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance, and today I want to ask a woman by the name of Nancy Honeycutt. Where are you, Nancy? To come on down. For those of you that don't know Nancy, Nancy is the individual that 20 years ago inspired this whole ceremony. And that's because I had the luck of meeting her. She witnessed a kidnapping of two little girls in the north area of Sacramento. And quite honestly, but for her actions that day of getting a license plate of an individual, that case would never have been solved. And that individual was responsible for kidnapping and sexually abusing a number of children in our community. The Sheriff's Department is probably very aware of that case, and that individual is now in prison. But I asked Nancy to come down and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance today, so we do that.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So many of you know that this week marks National Crime Victims' Rights Week. I saw Harriet in the room from Crime Victims United, and this really is our opportunity across this community, across this nation, to celebrate, to honor victims and victim advocates across this country and the rights that they have, and to promote their interests. And so this is kind of a culmination of that week. So I'm honored to be here in that capacity. Also, in addition, you'll see up on the overhead here are the quilts that are from our Homicide Support Network. So I ask you today to look at that quilt. These recognize the victims of homicide in our community over the last several decades, and I ask you to consider that when we go through today. So today is an opportunity to honor individuals for bravery, for personal sacrifice, for commitment and courage in pursuing justice. The recipients today have been nominated by deputy DAs, victim advocates, investigators in our office, because they have gone above and beyond, because they've gone to protect victims, to aid and assist a victim, to make great personal sacrifices when they come to court, and ultimately to serve the mission of our office, which is to seek justice, to serve justice, and to do justice. Before we get to the Outstanding Citizens Award, I wanted to take a few minutes. A few years ago, we decided that there were certain individuals or organizations in our community that, while they are not victims in a case or witnesses, they are well deserving of commendation for the service that they provide to our community. And so this year, we took it upon ourselves to recognize Sacramento's law enforcement chaplaincy. And so I'd ask Mindy and her crew to come up here if you can. And I want to talk to you just a little bit about the law enforcement chaplaincy. Some of you know who they are. Some of you may work with them because you are investigators, you're advocates. And some of you may not know really what they do on a daily basis. But what I have found over the last several years is that in this world there are ordinary people that do extraordinary things. And then there are people that are really angels among us. And they provide peace and they provide hope to individuals that are in very difficult times. And so when we talk about the law enforcement chaplaincy today, I have little doubt that they are angels among us. So what do they do? I mean, most people probably think, oh, they're the ones that have to go out and do death notifications. That's true. That's probably one of the hardest things I would imagine that they do. But they do many other things. They assist 19 different law enforcement agencies across this community. They partner with 16 different school districts, state and county government agencies, businesses, and churches across our region. It's not just about responding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at the very personal sacrifice of their own lives to help others. But it's also about getting into our communities to help kids in schools. I went out to BUI The Classroom, which is an incredible program that they partner with to try to educate kids on the dangers of drinking and driving. But they're out there trying to identify kids who are just simply in need for a mentor or a counselor. It's pretty incredible what they do on a daily basis. They support our members of law enforcement in times of need. So when we lose officers in our community, they are there to help them. Even though they are our first responders, they oftentimes themselves need grief counseling. On any given day, there are upwards of 100 law enforcement and community chaplains in our community out there trying to help others. So they bring a calming presence to those of us that are in need. They deal with every kind of situation you can imagine, not just homicides, but suicides, baby deaths, accidents, natural deaths, all of those types of things that we, as just individuals, never want to deal with ever in our personal lives. But they do it all for their own personal sacrifice to help those who are in need. If anybody really wants to know that the peace and the hope and really the inspiration that they provide, I would recommend that you all go home tonight and friend Mindy Russell on Facebook, because you will get a daily message from Mindy on all the good work they do. And if you have the luck, like I do, of now being her friend, you will oftentimes get a random text that just tells you that they're thinking about you today. And so that's what's so awesome about the law enforcement chaplaincy and the service they provide. And so today we honor them because they are the angels among us. So congratulations for the outstanding.
She said, "You want to say anything?" 1 minute or less. She knows me, doesn't she? I just want you to know we are so honored and grateful. We're recognized so many times. We don't ever expect a thank you, but when we do get it, it just keeps us going. So thank you all so very much. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're on to our Outstanding Citizens Award. And this year, I'm going to ask first off our Deputy District Attorney, Karina Orozco, to come up and start us off. Where are you, Q?
In the words of Malala Yousafzai, we call upon our sisters around the world to be brave, to embrace the strength within themselves and realize their full potential. Before I begin, let me just acknowledge, this is a really cool event. Today, we have an opportunity to get together with our community and recognize, in the face of negativity, people who do positive things. And we're all inundated with the news, day after day. Lots of negative messages that come our way. But in this room, we have victims whose lives have been forever changed by a tragic event. We have our law enforcement officers who put themselves on the front line every single day, risking their lives in order to make our community safe. And it's a bad time right now. I will say as a side note, it's a bad time for our officers, our law enforcement community. Not a lot of great news comes out, but And I speak for the great officers in this room. I know Sergeant Dan Roberts is here. He's worked on this particular case. My husband is here supporting this event. But I just want to give a round of applause to our law enforcement officers here. Thank you for your service. We have victim advocates in the room. These are the very fine people who help bridge the gap between our office and the circuitous world of the courts. They help the victims navigate that unknown world so that they can take the stand with ease and do what they need to do, even though it might be completely nerve-wracking. We have the district attorneys in this room who fight tirelessly every single day for justice. It's an honor for me to work with you all. I have a fine team. We're led by a fearless leader. And where's Anne Marie? There you go. What's cracking? But more over here, today we're talking about our outstanding citizens. And next to me, I have two young ladies, Rona Tide and Cassidy Samuelson. We're here to specifically celebrate the silent heroes who, without at times even a thanks, they put their own well-being and their own comforts at risk to help other people. They act despite the costs, despite the repercussions, to serve someone else, and they do so without the promise of reward or recognition. There's a quote by Charlotte Berry. It says, "We won't always know whose lives we touched and made better for our having cared, but because actions can sometimes have unforeseen ramifications. But what's important is that you do care and that you do act." As I stand here today, I'm just completely excited. 2 years ago, I stood before you and I recognized someone who I called a child hero, Santino. And some of you who were here 2 years ago remember he was a 13-year-old boy who walked into a room and found his babysitter on top of his 8-year-old sister. Now at the time, at 13 years old, they lived in a very rural area in Elk Grove, near Grant Line Road on a ranch. And there wasn't a telephone in the home, so Santino quietly backed away unbeknownst to the perpetrator and got on his bicycle and went from neighbor's house to neighbor's house looking for someone to help. Finding no one, he eventually rode his bike about a mile away to a nearby gas station where he found a good Samaritan pumping gas. And that Samaritan lent me his phone. And he brought law enforcement to the home where the perpetrator was taken into custody. We prosecuted that man, and he served eventually, or he will be serving 65 years to life in prison. Now, at the time, the family lived in Oregon, and they traveled here for the Outstanding Citizens Award. They brought 7 members of their family in a van to be here, and I'm excited because they're here today. So, Santino, can you please stand up? Stories like his are proof that extraordinary beings can come in small packages. Today I have a story of two more young women standing next to me who did something extraordinary. The story began on March 7th, 2007, over at Greer Elementary over on Hurley Way. That morning, Cassidy Samuelson, immediately to my left, was walking to school with her friend, Abigail. Now, Abigail was a very bubbly 11-year-old, and the two of them were very good friends. But that morning, there was something wrong. There was something wrong with Abigail. She was silenced. She was downtrodden. She looked defeated. And Cassidy did her very best to figure out what was wrong. But Abigail wouldn't budge. They got to school, and in their first period class, Cassidy continued to ask Abigail what was wrong, and Abigail responded silently with a note, a folded up note. And in that note, she informed Cassidy that the day before, she was raped by her stepfather. Now, Abigail was terrified. She didn't want to disclose to anyone because her stepfather also told her that he would kill her and her siblings were she to tell anyone. So she stayed an entire night in silence, and the next morning was so afraid, but decided to tell her one friend, Cassidy. But she still didn't want to tell anyone else. Cassidy got together with Rona, and the two girls banded together to provide comfort and support and a pillar of strength for Abigail. And after some time, they convinced Abigail to tell their PE teacher, who then took them, informed them that they should talk to the counselor, and they brought Abigail to the counselor, and then later stayed so that Abigail could talk to the vice principal and eventually law enforcement. They remained with her throughout the entire disclosure to several parties. These two young women at ages 10 and 11, I think Rona was 10 at the time, Cassidy was 11, participated with law enforcement and gave full statements. These were vibrant, innocent little fifth graders, and they were brought together into an unlikely sisterhood that would last a lifetime, even despite the fact that they're no longer in touch with one another as we sit here today. It just goes to show that sometimes a brief moment of kindness can leave an indelible mark on the spirit. On that morning, Abigail had disclosed to law enforcement that not only was she attacked forcibly the day prior, but that she had a belief that her sister Haley, who was just 2 years older than her, was also being molested. Law enforcement spoke with Haley, and Haley vehemently denied all the allegations. She said her sister was a liar, and she must have been jealous or just wanted attention. And it kind of put our investigation at a standstill. Needless to say, it came out later that Haley actually had engaged in a sexual relationship with the perpetrator, felt that she was in love with him, and was trying to protect him so that he wouldn't get taken away from her family. After Abigail's disclosure, her parents did the right thing. They relocated her to Idaho to live with her biological father, and they also sent Haley. But what happened was it set in motion a series of events. The defendant stole a car and drove it all the way to Idaho, where he kidnapped Haley from her school, drove her over state lines, where they were eventually found in Kansas. He was arrested, and we thought that would be the end of it, but in fact he escaped from custody, and he was found about a year and a half or so later in Texas at a vehicle checkpoint. He was eventually brought to justice. The trial began in Sacramento County in June of 2014, 7 years following Abigail's disclosure. Both Cassidy and Rona were called to the stand that June 16th, and they sat in the hallway, having not seen one another for many, many years. And I still recall calling Cassidy to the stand, and there was a very aggressive defense attorney on this case who had a knack for asking questions that often didn't matter, and I won't say her name, but it rhymes with Marsha Price. And even though these were just children, at the time they obtained the information for which they were to testify and were essentially fresh complaint witnesses, Marsha went for blood. And Cassidy stood on that stand, or sat at the stand, repeatedly responding to the same question asked over and over, not even differently at times. And there was a moment during her cross-examination where she essentially turned her chair entirely around. And I'm sitting there looking at her back, and Judge Megan is looking down at her back, and we're about to call it quits because we realized she was crying. But then, in an exorcist-like way, she came right back around. And I don't know if there was a Judge Megan had some special button back there, like a fire drill button or something, but she came back, and she stared the enemy in the eyes, and came back head to head, It was, I think the jurors were all like, get her, like they were panicked. It was a great day for the people when Cassidy and Rhoda took the stand 7 years after this event. David Thompson was brought to justice almost immediately after the jury was sent out. They returned a verdict finding him guilty on all 14 counts, plus a multiple victim enhancement. He was later sentenced to not only 65 years, but an additional 390 years to life. Why are these two young women so special? Because at age 10 and 11, they stepped forward to help a scared little girl find her strength and stand against evil. They did what was right. Their actions displayed love and bravery and kindness to someone who had no one to stand for her, including her own sister. And they needed no reason at all to do that other than that she was a friend. But that's not the end of it. They came back at 17 years old, and they themselves put themselves on the face of evil to stand strong for someone who they no longer knew, but they still cared for. And despite their fears, they spoke their truth. Malala Yousafzai is a Pakistani activist. She stands for female education, and she's the youngest ever Nobel Prize laureate. She's known mainly for her human rights advocacy and for education and for women in her native country of northwestern Pakistan. Malala was about 10 years old at the same time you two both were. And in her spirit, in everything she stands for, you two stood for the same, for a sister, for someone who had nothing more to give you other than a thank you. And on her behalf, I say thank you. So a message to Rhoda and Cassidy as you walk away today. I want to tell you, remember a few things. Remember that you're amazing. As you are, you're stronger than you know, more beautiful than you think, worthier than you believe, more loved than you could ever imagine, passionate about making a difference, and fiery when protecting those you love. You're learning, you're growing, and you're not alone. You're warm, giving, and generous, funny and smart, flawed, whole, scared, yet brave. And so be strong, be confident, and be you, because you inspire all of us. Anne Marie Schubert, I present to you Rona Tayeg and Cassidy Sampson for the academic.
Thank you for that, Karina. Next up, Amy Holiday.
Good morning. With me this morning is Amanal Dorsey, one of our victim advocates in the office, and she was the advocate on the case that I'm going to be speaking about this morning. Just before 7 o'clock a.m. on June 6th of 2013, two men who were down on their luck, Mr. Toussaint Harrison and Justin Oliphant, came to the McDonald's located at Arden and Howe. And they were there handing out food to people who were in a similar situation as themselves that morning. Also at the McDonald's at that time was a man named Joseph Leonard and a female friend of his. And the female waited in the parking lot for Mr. Leonard, and Mr. Oliphant approached her and asked her if she was hungry. Mr. Leonard saw this exchange through the window of the McDonald's and became angry that Mr. Oliphant would dare speak to this woman. Came outside and a verbal argument ensued. During the altercation, Mr. Leonard used racially charged terms towards Mr. Harrison and Mr. Oliphant, and then took it to the next level by getting a chain out of the back of his truck and swinging it at the two men. Ultimately, Mr. Harrison and Mr. Oliphant were able to get away and head west down Arden Way. They made it past several businesses, past the car wash there, past the optical business, down near the Clutch Mart. When they got down to the Clutch Mart, all of a sudden, Mr. Leonard is there, but this time he's in his truck. Mr. Leonard headed directly towards Mr. Oliphant first, who was able to dive out of the way and avoid being struck, landing on the asphalt. After that, Mr. Leonard turned his attention to Mr. Harrison. He drove his truck right at Mr. Harrison, accelerated to the point that his truck broke traction and struck Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison flew into the air, landed on the hood, the windshield, and then ultimately on the ground. Dan Gandy, who is here with us today, was a mechanic at the Clutch Mart. He'd been there for what, 15, 16 years? The Clutch Mart. He was clocking in for work at about 7 o'clock a.m. when he heard loud skidding sounds and a thump. I remember him telling the officers it was so loud that he thought it was actually two cars hitting each other. He went outside to see what was going on, and he saw Mr. Harrison there right in front of the Clutch Mart. He'd never seen Mr. Harrison before. Mr. Harrison had bloody foam coming from his mouth. He was gasping for air. Mr. Gandy then saw the Chevy truck turn, attempt to strike Mr. Oliphant again, missing a second time. He then saw the truck spin around and head directly towards Mr. Harrison for a second time. Mr. Gandy stood between Mr. Harrison and the oncoming truck. The truck continued to accelerate towards Mr. Gandy. Mr. Gandy feared that both he and Mr. Harrison were going to be struck. Mr. Gandy never wavered. He did not move. At the last moment, Leonard swerved the truck away from him and Mr. Harrison. The truck then stopped. Mr. Leonard got out, walked over to where Mr. Harrison was laying, bleeding on the ground. Leonard then began to kick Mr. Harrison in the face and in the head while wearing steel-toed boots. Mr. Gandy at that point yelled for his co-worker, Frank Folger, to call the police. He then ran inside, grabbed a pry bar, came back outside, and told, well, I won't say it, what he said. But he made it clear that Mr. Leonard needed to get away from Mr. Harrison, and was successful in doing so. Mr. Leonard continued to make racial slurs during this time towards Mr. Harrison. Mr. Gandy, quickly thinking, took the keys out of Mr. Leonard's truck and told him that the police were coming. Before the police arrived, Leonard told Mr. Gandy, I know where you work, and when this is all said and done, I'll find you and we'll settle this. The fire department got there, took Mr. Harrison to the hospital immediately. When the police got there, Leonard was detained and arrested. Mr. Harrison sustained major head trauma and died 2 days later on June 8th, 2013. Leonard was charged with the murder of Mr. Harrison, the attempted murder of Mr. Oliphant, and with hate crime allegations. Sacramento County Sheriff's Department Deputy Gene Goff placed Leonard in his patrol car, and I'm ever so thankful that he turned on his in-car camera during that time that Leonard was sitting in the back of the patrol car alone. And as I was preparing this case for trial, I thought I better see if there's anything on here. And I just kind of let the tape play, and he's just sitting there for quite some time, and about 30 or 40 minutes into him sitting in the back of the patrol car, he looks out the window at one point and says, "Just because we got Obama for a president, these people think they're so special." And my head whipped around. Did I just hear that right? Played it back, and needless to say, that was part of the evidence at trial offered against Mr. Leonard. The case went to trial in October of 2014. I contacted all the witnesses, let them know they were going to be needed to testify. And when it was getting close in time for Mr. Gandy to testify, I called him and I simply asked if he was available next Wednesday. His reply was, "I'm a married man. I don't know what my wife would think of that." I was thinking, I don't want a date, I just want you to come testify. Oftentimes doing this job, we read lots of police reports and the words kind of can fall flat sometimes when you're reading them. You don't really take in the magnitude of what has happened. But when Mr. Gandy came and testified, it really hit me about what he had seen and experienced that day. Mr. Gandy risked his own life in order to attempt to save the life of a complete stranger. And if not the life, then from him sustaining major additional harm. And like Karina said, in such tumultuous times, with all the issues that are around us currently, Mr. Gandy didn't care about the color of Mr. Harrison's skin. He didn't care about where he came from, how much money he had, or anything about him. All he knew that was he was a human being, a fellow human being, and he was going to help him out. Dan, you're a hero. I thank you for selflessly helping Mr. Harrison that day. Leonard was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder, and the jury found that all the hate crime allegations were true. Judge Steve White sentenced Leonard to the maximum punishment allowed by law. Sometimes the worst part of being a prosecutor, especially in homicide cases, is even though you're helping obtain justice for a family that's lost a loved one, you can't bring them back, and you can't take away the pain. Mr. Harrison's family is here today. Alice, his aunt, Andre, his cousin, and his 18-year-old son, Markel, who I met for the first time today. They all made the trip from the Bay Area to be here today. And Alice and Andre in particular, I want to thank you for your support during the trial. And I meant what I said, that I could feel your support from the back of the courtroom. I also want to thank the detectives and the deputies from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and DA Investigator Ron Garbrick for the great job that they did on this case. I also want to thank our victim advocate, Amanal Dorsey, for your endless support and advice. And you're not just there for the victims, you're there for us too. And I appreciate that. Couldn't do it without you. Your commitment to the victims of crimes and their families are inspiring. Dan, will you come on up? Dan, a million thank yous will never be enough for what you've done for Mr. Harrison. Ladies and gentlemen, if you ever find yourself in need of help on Arden Way, use your hand. Anne Marie, I present to you Dan Gandy as an outstanding citizen of Sacramento County. No, he doesn't want the attention.
I've now sat through a few of these where Amy Holiday does a presentation, and I'm thinking we should bar her from the future because it's always so powerful, and the tears typically come, which is another reminder of why we do the job. Next up, I'm going to ask Valerie Brown to come, if that's okay.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know, this is our victim advocate who worked this case with me, Michelle Husbands. And this, I'm very proud to say, is John Escoda. When most people hear about this case that I'm going to tell you about, the first thing that shocks them, and probably the most shocking thing, is that it occurred in broad daylight in a busy, small little shopping center in South Sacramento, less than 2 weeks before Christmas. It could have been any one of us in John Escoda's position. He had gone there that day with his family. He was going to get a haircut. He went into Fly Cuts barber shop. His wife, Nina, went next door to a salon. His oldest son, Johnny, and two of his younger children, as well as Johnny's girlfriend, Alexandra, waited in the car in the parking lot. Monique Nelson had gone there as well. Rod said, don't embarrass me, so I'll try not to here. But Monique took her little 2.5-year-old son, Jaden, to that same little busy shopping center to get Christmas pictures taken. So they go into the shop and they pose for some photos. And Monique selected one. It had Jaden nestled on her lap, wearing his little red Santa hat, smiling. And she left for a while they were being developed. She never got to use that photo in her home. That photo became a piece of evidence in the trial of the people who killed her. John Escoda, his family, and Monique Nelson had no way of knowing that a simmering feud was about to erupt in unimaginable violence that day and change their lives and others forever. About 2 weeks earlier, brothers Lewis and Lonnie Mitchell began a feud with Marvion Barksdale over a robbery of some marijuana. And on this day, when the Escodas were there just to take care of business, Monique was there to get her pictures, and so many other people were going about their law-abiding business. An acquaintance, Larry Jones, showed up at Fly Cuts, and he had a .40 caliber weapon, .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun. Shortly after, the Mitchell brothers showed up. Concealed on their clothing, under their clothing, they had a Tech 9, an AK-47, and a .45 caliber semi-automatic. There were some hard looks exchanged, and Larry Jones called James Carney, a friend of his, an associate, so we say, who then called Marvion Barksdale. And very quickly, Marvion, his cousin Charles Barksdale, and one of their associates, Dominique Lott, arrived at the scene. Lott and Marvion had 9mm semi-autos on them as they walked up to that barber shop. James Carney had arrived at the same time with his .38 caliber revolver, and he approached from the opposite side. And as these 5 men came together there at the entrance to Fly Cuts, they began an exchange of gunfire that lasted for several minutes. They fired wildly at each other without zero regard for anybody who was in that parking lot or in that barber shop. And when the gunfire stopped, that scene looked like something you would see on the evening news of some war-torn country far away, not a busy little shopping center in South Sacramento. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies responded to the scene, and they saw a gray Chevy Tahoe with the back door open. Inside, they found Monique Nelson lying on top of Jaden, who was in his car seat. Monique was dead. She had one gunshot wound under her arm. One of the deputies was a very seasoned, hardened gang detective. 3 years after this, he still choked up as he described walking up and seeing Jaden sitting there patting his mother's head, crying. They removed Monique, and Deputy Anthony Jenkins came up and took Jaden, thankfully, away, so he never had to see his mother, who the other deputy removed and laid on the ground. Deputy Danny McCullough stayed with Monique for hours until her body was not removed. And Deputy Jenkins stayed with Jaden. And there was a news clip that played back then, and it showed Jaden running, and it showed a paramedic firefighter who you can't see his face because of all his paraphernalia that he's got on in the angle of the camera. But he scoops Jaden up and he swings him up, and you can see he's kind of playing with him, and he takes him away. Well, for anyone who doesn't know that scene, let me tell you, if Jaden had gone a few steps further, he would have been there with his mother. And I know that Monique's family is very grateful to that unnamed firefighter paramedic, and to Deputy Jenkins, and to Deputy McCullough. Now, inside that barber shop was this man, John Escoto, and a number of other customers. There were 4 of them wounded. Mr. Escoto suffered a gunshot graze wound to his leg. And despite that, despite his concern, obvious natural concern for his family nearby, what he did, nobody else did. When the gunfire stopped, Mr. Escoto immediately went to the aid of another customer, Adam Wade, who had been shot in the stomach and was bleeding profusely. Mr. Escoto applied pressure, asked people to bring things to him so he could stem the bleeding, and he saved Adam Wade's life. He stayed with him until the paramedics got there. But he did more than that, because when the police finally arrived, some of these witnesses had fled. Some injured had even taken themselves to the hospital. One of the barbers continued cutting hair as the deputies were trying to tend to the wounded and clear the area. So many people in that little shopping center that day, either through their hatred for law enforcement, their fear of gang retaliation, or just plain ambivalence, did nothing to help. No one knew Monique was out there. And I would dare say if Mr. Escoto knew Monique was there with Jaden, he would have been there helping her. But Mr. Escoto didn't leave. He didn't take his family away and run away from this. He stayed. He gave a statement to the police. He cooperated fully and eagerly. And I do want to take a minute to acknowledge a few people before we get on to what this man is all about. First of all, there were so many officers involved in this, and some of them are here today. Lieutenant Jim Barnes, homicide detectives Tony Turnbull, Ken Clark, Paul Belli, along with more than 45 other deputies from the Sheriff's Department, Sacramento Police Department, Elk Grove Police Department, Sacramento County Probation, and the State Parole Agency worked this case around the clock until they were able to sort out what happened and arrest those who were responsible. DA investigator Teresa Call was instrumental in getting our witnesses there many times. And of course, we could not have done it without Michelle Husbands. She worked with Monique's family to get them through this process that took more than 3.5 years. Detective Turnbull gave up his summer. He's here today to honor Mr. Escoto, and he sat through that trial and helped me present the evidence. And I will say, I have to stop and thank Monique's family. Because there are no words, obviously, to describe the pain they suffered. Throughout the 3.5 years that it took to take this case to trial, they showed nothing but grace, dignity, and patience. And they too are very grateful to Mr. Escoto and the law enforcement. In fact, Monique's Aunt Beatrice is here today just to honor Mr. Escoto. So let's talk a little bit about this man next to me. He obviously was concerned for his family, never wavered in his commitment to this case. Every time I would call him and ask him, we need to reschedule, we need to find a date for you, his response was, just tell me when and where, and I will be there. And there came a day when I had to tell him that his son Johnny had to testify, fully expecting him to say no, as we often hear. But what he said was, okay, when shall we be there? He and Johnny came up when the trial finally started, and they lived a distance away. So they traveled up here expecting only to be here one day, but they had to spend the night because their testimony went over to the following day. There were 4 defense attorneys in the case, and it took a while. On their Facebook page, his wife Nina posted a picture of him. It was a selfie I think you guys took in the hallway of the courthouse, actually. She posted it, and she said, missing these two greatly. And someone said, where did they go? And she said, well, doing the right thing isn't always easy. And that was it. That's all she had to say. And she knows her husband. Mr. Escoto has spent his adult life doing the right things that are not always easy. Mr. Escoto and Nina raised 6 wonderful, loving, respectful children who are all here today to honor their daddy. And he spent 22.5 years in the United States Army. He had 4 deployments to Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom. He suffered so many wounds, physical wounds, traumatic brain injury from combat gunfights, and multiple explosions of IEDs. At trial, he testified about his military experience, and he testified about some of his injuries. And of course, the defense attorneys tried to seize that opportunity to show him to be an unreliable witness, somebody who couldn't remember things, somebody who couldn't really hear and distinguish things properly. And while he testified that when the gunfire started, he tried to make himself small so that he wouldn't get shot, which was difficult to do because in that day he was wearing braces on his legs to help him walk. So he didn't see who shot what gun, but because of his military experiences, he was able to define and describe by sound every weapon that was fired, the location, and in what sequence. There was only one time when he hesitated and questioned his own opinion, and that was when he said, there was one at the front, I'm not sure, I think it was a MAC-10. It could have been a Tech 9, but I think it was a MAC-10, and it was a Tech 9. So while they tried to discredit him, they couldn't, because his descriptions were spot on and corroborated by the casings, the location of those casings, and the holes in the walls and the cars outside. There was one defense attorney who was particularly aggressive and made him actually relive all of his military experiences and his wounds. And he was particularly hard on John's memory. And he said, well, you just don't remember things, right? Especially traumatic events. And John looked at him and he said, oh no, I remembered most things. Some things I forget, but I always remember traumatic events. It's just that I don't want to sometimes. And this particular defense attorney unwisely continued on and said, tell us some of the things you can't do anymore because of your military wounds. And I'm sure he was anticipating that John would say something like, well, he couldn't move as quick, or he couldn't hear as well. But John's answer was, hold my children. you know, you don't know why things happen in life, but really without those military experiences, that jury would never have known and been able to sort through who did what when. And it is because of that that the Mitchell brothers are serving life in prison, and James Carney is put away for 11 years. Charles Barksdale the same, Dominique Lott the same. Larry Jones was able to walk away when the jury acquitted him, but he'll be back, and we'll be waiting for him when he is. When John was selected for this award, we contacted Monique's family, and as I said, her Aunt Beatrice is here, but her mother, Deborah, could not be here. She does not live nearby, and it was just impossible for her to get up here. But she did send a letter, and I'd like to read it and end with it because it speaks so much about John. Actually, I think I have my shelter.
Okay. This is a letter of appreciation to Mr. John Escoto. We were elated to hear that the District Attorney's Office was going to recognize and honor the remarkable job you did in my daughter's, Monique Roxanne Nelson's, murder trial. Under intense scrutiny and the relentless attacks to try and discredit you as a reliable witness, you stood tall and did not waver from telling the truth. Your openness about your disability that was acquired in the military made me respect you even more. Although you may have suffered a brain injury, the entire courtroom was amazed at your level of professionalism and ability to recall even the minutest of details. The integrity and courage that you exhibited on the witness stand exceeded all expectations. The actions you took that fateful day in the barbershop resounds an unsung hero to me. So let this special award and recognition give you a sense of satisfaction in knowing that you have indeed made a difference in this world. It must have been terrifying to be caught in the barrage of gunfire on that violent day and to even be wounded. Instead of focusing on your own wounds, you reached out to help others. What a brave soul you are, and a positive role model for your children and the youth today. You gained strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stopped to look fear in the face. You were able to say to yourself, I have lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. On behalf of my beloved daughter and family, we wish to express our sincerest appreciation for the role you played as we fought to attain justice for Monique. Our family has been forced to come to terms with a devastating loss. Your willingness to shed light on what really happened on December 14, 2010 at Fly Cuts Barbershop helped to ease our pain. The criminals responsible for this spree of violence are being punished, in part because of your testimony. May you and your family receive a shower of blessings in all your future endeavors. Monique Nelson's family.
And if I might have your indulgence, if I can ask Johnny to stand up. This is John's son, Johnny. He was the one that shielded his little brothers and sisters and his girlfriend Alexandra that day out in the car when the gunfire erupted. And he is the young man who came with his father to testify in this trial. And he did so bravely, and he did so well. So if you can all just give a hand to him. Mr. Escoto, he has received many awards, many medals in his life based on his military career. In fact, he is a Purple Heart recipient. And it is my honor, my true honor, Anne Marie, to present to you Mr. John Escoto for this year's Outstanding Citizen.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Mr. Escoto. And last but surely not least, I'd like to invite up Deputy DA Carlton Davis for the last awards.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored here to honor both Elliot and Brandon Garcia through these touching stories that we've heard today. We all know that violence can happen anywhere. It can happen at a barbershop, like Valerie mentioned. It can happen at a home. It can happen in the incident that Ms. Holliday mentioned. It can happen anywhere. And what I'm going to tell you is that it can also happen at a party being thrown by the Sac State golf team. And I think everyone here would agree that we all would probably feel safe ourselves or to have our children go to a Sac State golf party. If our child called us and said, I'm going to a Sac State golf party, we would say, have a good time, just come back home. And that's what these two young men thought when they went to the Sac State golf party on May 11th of 2013. But what they did not know was that the Sac State golf team wanted to have a rager. They wanted to have a real good party. And so they promoted it on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter. They handed out flyers. They told anyone and everyone about this party. And over 100 people, if not more, showed up to this party. There was so many people there that all these people could not fit inside of the party. And so when Elliot Goldstein got to the party, he had to wait in line so as people came out, they would be able to go in. And he noticed in front of him a group of people that did not look like they went to Sac State. He noticed these guys, and he didn't have any idea that it was a madman amongst this group named Tino Perez, who was a known Norteño gang member in Sacramento. And Elliot didn't know that. And he could tell that this Tino Perez character, this guy, was the leader amongst these young men that he was with. The party was a normal party, but arguments started amongst Tino Perez and his friends, and Tino Perez told everyone at the party who would listen that some black people are going to be shot tonight, but he didn't use the word black people. He used another word, and he was telling everyone at the party that that is what's going to happen. Eventually, the host of the party realized that things were getting out of hand, and they shut the party down. Brandon Garcia, who did not know Elliot Goldstein, they weren't friends, they just happened to come to the same party together, had come with his friends and had decided to leave early. And as they were leaving, they saw an argument between a woman and a man. And they did what any mother would want her son to do if you see what looks like a man about to hit a woman. Brandon Garcia and his friends intervened before that man hit that woman and got in between them and told that man, you need to leave. And because Brandon was there with 4 other guys, the guy didn't put up a fight, and he left. And Brandon and his friends then sought the woman to make sure that she was okay. While this was going on up the street from the party, Tino Perez and his friends were causing fights with these college students. And Tino Perez decided to pull out the revolver that he brought to the party, and he fired in the air 2 times. After he fired in the air, as he was doing that, he saw Brandon and his friends talking to his female friend. And he wanted to cause more trouble. And so he ran up to his female friend and he said, what's going on here? And she said, nothing's going on, Tina. Everything is cool. These guys helped me out. This other guy was about to hit me. They got him to leave. It's cool. And Tino wasn't hearing it. And so then Brandon and his friend said, hey man, it's all good. We don't want any trouble here. We're just trying to go home. We saw this guy arguing with, I guess, with your friend. We don't want anything to happen. Let's just go home. Let us go home. And Tino ignored them. And what happened next is that Tino pulled out that revolver. Once he pulled out that revolver, he then aimed it towards Brandon's 2 friends who were up the street. And he started shooting at those 2 men. And their names were Dwayne Magnum Hines and Jahi Vaughn. And he shot both of those men. Immediately after shooting Dwayne and Jahi, he then turned around and another friend of Brandon's named Kevin Bouzet started running away from Tino and tried to run into some bushes. And Tino then shot Kevin Bouzet, and Kevin fell to the ground. At this point, it's only 2 of them left, Brandon and his friend Jakari Brown. and they decided to hide behind a car, thinking that this madman won't come around the car or shoot them, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. So Tino then came over the car and started shooting over the car at them as they're trying to dodge bullets. And Jakari Brown, thinking that he's about to get shot in the head, decided to make a run for it. And as Jakari Brown started running, Tino then shot him. And so now 4 of Brandon's friends, the guys that he came with, his brothers, who he's been hanging out with for 4 years in college, are all shot. It looks like there was a war going on. They're all screaming in pain. And Brandon's hiding behind the car, and he had to make a choice. Does he want to continue hiding? Does he want to run for bushes like his friends did and end up getting shot? Or does he want to make sure that Tino does not shoot anyone else? Because this is not an empty street. These are all kids leaving this party. It's full of kids as Tino's doing all this. And Brandon chose option number 3. And he decided to tackle Tino Perez because his back was turned, because he was focused on shooting Jakari Brown. And Brandon and Tino argued or fought over that gun that was in Tino's hand. But Tino was not going to give it up without a fight. And Brandon and Tino were fighting over that gun. And while that was going on, Elliot Goldstein was leaving the party. And he, amongst all the other college students, saw what's going on here. He sees these 4 guys that have just been shot screaming for help. He sees Brandon fighting with Tino trying to get the gun away. And Elliot, just like Brandon, had to make a choice. He could have just turned a blind eye and said, not my problem, I'm gonna go back towards the house, I'm gonna go somewhere else, not my problem, I'm not getting involved. He could have tried to go run and hide in some bushes like a lot of people did. We all would understand if he decided to do option 1 or 2. Because he didn't know Brandon, he didn't know these guys, he didn't know Tino. He could have said, I gotta worry about myself. But Elliot decided to help Brandon, to make sure that all the other college students that were there would not get shot. And he also helped Brandon tackle Tino and bring him to the ground. And once that happened, Tino fell to the ground and Brandon was able to finally get the gun out of Tino's hands, and he threw it into the street. Once this happened, Tino jumped up and ran into a waiting car and went off into the night. And the officers came, and of course, Tino and his friends crashed the party. So no one knew them. So when officers were saying, who was this madman? Who was this guy that did this? No one could identify him and could say his name is Tino Perez. And Detective Sean Ayers, who's sitting here, was investigating the case, and the case got cold because no one could identify Tino Perez. But fortunately, a neighbor of Tino's called Detective Ayers and said, maybe it was Tino Perez who did this, I don't know. Tino was arrested, he had an alibi. He said, I wasn't even there, I was somewhere else. He had friends come in and testify that he wasn't even there. But Detective Ayers was smart enough to download information in Tino's phone. And when they spoke to Brandon Garcia, he was able to describe the gun that was in that madman's hand because he argued with him. He said it was a silver revolver that barely stuck out of his hand. It was a small silver revolver. And through the investigation, after he downloaded that phone, it was over 2,000 pictures that Tino had on that phone. And Detective Dave Kidd took it upon himself. When I gave him that assignment, I said, there could be something good on this phone, that we know that there was a silver revolver used, that he started looking through those 2,000 pictures. And all we had, that gun that Brandon threw, was never found. All we had was just the handle of the gun that was used. And it was through Dave Kidd looking through those 2,000 pictures that we eventually found a photo that Tino had taken on his phone of a silver revolver that was a .22. And the handle of the gun on the phone matched the handle that was found at the scene. But Tino had this alibi. He said, so what? Just because the phone matches, I got my friends going to come in and say I wasn't even involved. What are you going to do? Detective Ayers spoke to Elliot Goldstein. And Elliot Goldstein had been waiting in that line to get into that party, and he had recognized the guy who appeared to be the leader. And he recognized that person had an unusual tattoo. And that tattoo was the state of California, that Tino had on his face. And Detective Ayers is smart enough that when he showed a photo lineup of Tino Perez to Elliot. He took that photo with the state of California off so that, you know, there wouldn't be any confusion. And within 30 seconds of looking at that photo, Elliot said, "That's the guy who was the madman." Except the state of California is not on his face. He had a tattoo of the state of California on his face. So, other than that, that's the same guy. And it was through their efforts that by the time we got to trial, even though Tino had an alibi, even though they argued that it could have been anyone there, Elliot had no problem coming into court, looking Tino in the eye, and saying, "I saw you before the party started. I tackled you when you were arguing with Brandon." Brandon had no problem coming into court saying, "I know it was you, that you had that silver revolver, that it was a revolver that did it." And Tino could not get around that. And it was from their efforts that he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 160 years to life for what he did at that party. So like I said, violence can happen anywhere. We all know that. We didn't have to come to this event. But it was through these heroes today that they are rare. Even though violence can happen anywhere, people like these two men and the other people mentioned, it's because of these heroes that make us as DAs and law enforcement officers feel proud about our jobs. And Anne Marie, that's why I am proud to have you honor these two men, Brandon Garcia and Elliot Goldstein.
Just to let you guys know, I ain't prepared anything specific. But honestly, this case has really shed light on a lot of things in my life. And if I could shed light on one thing to everybody and touch bases with anybody, it's this. The fact that we all go through trials, we all go through tribulations. We are all playing this unseen battle of chess, life. You have to think before you move every time you act. Every action in your life affects more than just your own action. There are people that are now not able to move any pieces. 160 years, his family will not see him. Think about your actions before you do them. They affect more than your own.
For any of us that have been in this business a long time, it's always so rewarding to come to this, because I would dare find anybody in this room that is not inspired or moved by the stories that we've seen today. And it kind of reinforces for every one of us, whether we're DAs, law enforcement advocates, support staff, and why we do this job. So I'd like to end it by asking all the recipients to come up. We'll take a group picture, and then we'll close it out in a second. So if you can all come up. we cannot do this job, our daily work, unless we have individuals who are willing to be superheroes, who are willing to put on that cape every single day, whether it be police officers, victims, or witnesses. And ultimately, we also can't do it unless we have angels among us to bring us the peace and the hope and ultimately the inspiration that we have to pursue the passion that we all have in this world. So with that, it's a great day for the people. So thank you all for coming. There's a reception outside if you want any cookies or cakes. But thank you. We'll see you all next year.